This is a really important period in American history. We are between the wars, and as you guys know, we checked out of the Versailles security system. We did not adopt the Versailles Treaty. We did not enter the League of Nations. We're outside of it. The Versailles Treaty tried to remake Europe, and a big part of it was to diminish the power of Germany. But all they really did was make Germany exceedingly upset and set the stage for the French's worst nightmare, which was these two guys together, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. Now, it's going to take him a while. Mussolini will come to power first in Italy, and he'll challenge the French position in the Mediterranean. But it's not until we get the rise of Adolf Hitler that the shadows are rising for France. Now, the big question is, how is America going to respond to this international environment in which we find ourselves? We have not engaged the world, and the world is in a lack of leadership. And there's a transition going on. America is this rising great industrial and financial power, and yet we have thought we could continue to do the things we'd always done. We liked being a neutral nation that made money on commerce around the world. We never had a big military that we kept up between the wars. We didn't have a big navy even until the late 19th century. We're beginning to build one, and then World War I will give us a bigger navy. But we're not interested in directly, politically, and militarily involving ourselves in international alliances and security systems until the end of World War II. And after World War II, we're going to decide that we've got to be the main force in the world, because if we don't shape it, other forces will shape it that will be injurious to us. So we are a world power after the war. And these are the lessons that lead us to it. Right now there's a lot of talk about the Russian government taking over this part of the Crimea, eastern part, and the Crimean Peninsula out of the Ukraine. And I had some students the other day in class say, why do we feel that we have to get involved and even have anything to say about what's going on over there? And what all of our leaders are doing is they're looking back at World War II and this interwar period when Germany went on the march and saw no aggression and kept going. Same thing with Japan. And so we pay attention to how do we deal with aggression. Currently, we're looking at economic sanctions against Russia to send them a signal that we're not happy about it, and beefing up our NATO allies in the eastern part of Europe. Now, all of this is because we know we've got to do something, and this is what we look back at. Our failure to respond effectively to aggression during the interwar period, 1919, 1939. All right. So this first period, this is broken up into two periods. 1919 to 1932, we talk about America being practicing what we call independent internationalism. We're independent as in we're not in the League of Nations. We're independent, we haven't signed off on the Versailles Treaty. But we are engaged in the world, and we do get in things like the Dawes Plan and the Washington Naval Conference, and later on the Naval Conference. By the way, the big shift that takes place is going to be 1932. When the Great Depression breaks out, we're going to recalibrate where we are in the world. And also we're going to see the rise of all kinds of problems in Europe that are going to make us think maybe we should just stay out of the place. But at first, here's this first phase here. What I want you to know about the Washington Naval Conference is that it is a conference that's going to look at stopping a potential naval arms race. Arms races are when countries build up an armaments industry in anticipation of friction and a resumption of warfare between the nations. That's what arms races are, is when we are anxious about our neighbors and how they might act. The conferees, the people who come to it, are Great Britain, United States, France, Italy, and then Japan. What's the interesting thing about all these countries with regard to World War I? And with regard to World War I, they were all what? Allies? Yes, they were all allies against Germany. You would think that this group could get together and have no problems, right? But in fact, we find out that there are now frictions emerging between the United States and Great Britain, and between the French and the Italians in the Mediterranean. And there's friction growing between the United States and Japan in Asia. Our main concern is that the Japanese have begun to move into Manchuria in the early 1900s. They fought that war with Russia, as you saw. They've now gotten onto mainland China. By the way, the Japanese are the only non-Western industrialized nation. We are responsible for the rise of Japan as an industrial nation. In 1850, Commodore Perry, with the U.S. gunship, arrived at Japan asking for a commercial treaty with Japan so we could begin to sell to them. But Japan was always known as the hermit kingdom. They would not let outsiders come into Japan. They wanted to preserve their culture as it was. But we forced them, under the threat of a bombardment of Tokyo in 1850, for them to open up commercial trade with us. That scared the Japanese completely because they did not have this industrial power that we had. And here we are half a world away, forcing them to do what we want. To the Japanese, as they had done one other time in history, decided to study their enemy and to recreate themselves. And so they go into industry and they study American business practices. They know that they need a military apparatus. They study the British one because they've got the best navy. They study the German army to build a strong military program for armed forces once they hit the ground. And they study the German imperial bureaucracy and how that works because it functions so well. And Japan, between 1850 and 1920, now 70 years, has become a strong industrial power. They lack resources because they're fairly small, but they have a large population. They begin to see Asia, northern China, and China itself as their place to expand to. We've got a problem with that. And why does the United States have a problem with Japanese taking over China? Why are we interested in China? Trade. It's the bottom line. We want to sell industrialized products to China. We want to bring American business to China, offer services and industries. All the way back to, I think it would be 1890s, we begin to become interested in China. So, Japanese aggression in China is bothering us. And we do something important at the Washington Naval Conference. Here's something you want to write down. We convince the British that we are not a threat to them in building a large navy. One problem that Great Britain had, Great Britain, since the 1700s, has realized that commerce is its thing. And if you're going to have commerce, you've got to have a big navy. And so it became the number one navy in the world. And it had what was called a two-navy power theory. It had to be bigger than number 2 and number 3 combined. So they had to be really big, number 1 navy in the world, bigger than the next 2 combined. The problem for the British is that we're beginning to build a navy. And they felt threatened by that. At the Washington Naval Conference, 2 things happened. We convinced the British that we are not a threat to them, and that we will do our best to cooperate with them. And we convinced them that the Japanese are the problem. And we get the British to break their friendly relations with the Japanese and begin to view the Japanese as a threat. And that's good for us. We want that because we would like the British to be on our side in Asia against what we see as growing Japanese aggression. France and Italy can't get its problems worked out. The Italians are very frustrated by the Versailles Treaty. The French had ended up with all these things over here in Syria, and they had influence in Lebanon. And the Italians were denied the things that they thought they should have gotten out of the war. And so the Italians and French leave at odds with one another. Last thing I'll say about the Washington Naval Conference is it demonstrates that we're interested in the world and in alliances, but we don't want anything too formal. I will say this also about the Washington Naval Conference. We got caught reading the other conferees' mail and their diplomatic information as it came to them, because during this conference they're all getting reports back from their home countries, and we wanted to know what the British were being told by their government, and we wanted to know what the French were being told. We got caught doing that, and we thought, well, it's kind of like reading your email with somebody. You really want to know what they're thinking, you can read their email. right, with their diary. And so that irritates the other European powers, but we try to explain that we're kind of new to this, and that's just how it's espionage, I suppose. All right. Moving on from there, we don't solve the arms race entirely. We slow down, though, on our building. Japan doesn't slow down in their building. All right, the Dawes Plan. Now, I've mentioned this to you before, but I want to go ahead and mention to you something that leads to it, and that is the Ruhr crisis. Because it helps understand a couple of big things that are taking place in Europe. The French... Well, all the Allies decided that the Germans were going to have to be responsible for the costs of World War I. You may remember that the Germans brought the Versailles Treaty to them in June 1919, and they had to send representatives from Berlin to meet them in a railroad car and sign this treaty. And in that treaty, Article 231 said the Germans were responsible for all costs of war, and that they would eventually get a tab for this. Well, the tab finally comes in, and they owe $55 billion to the French, Belgians, Italians, and the British. The Germans say, there's no way we can pay this. And so the French and the Belgians decide to invade the eastern part of Germany, which is called the Ruhr area. And in the Ruhr area, there was lots of coal mines, and lots of steel production and iron ore deposits. It was a very important industrial part of Germany. The French and Belgians, they seize the apparatus, the equipment, the factories, and they say, we'll run these factories. They'll have their military there, and we'll keep up with everything we produce, and we'll take it off what you owe us. So you say you can't pay, we'll make you pay this way. Now, what this leads to is what is called hyperinflation. The Germans don't know how to respond. They're really not prepared for war. Oh, by the way, a little aside here. When the Belgians and French do that, we think that that's highly controversial, and that's going to create real problems in Germany as far as like lasting peace between the states. We had American troops still stationed on the border there with Germany after World War I, but after the British and Belgians go in, the Belgians and French go in, we pull out our troops because we think that's not a good move on the part of the French and Belgians. It's going to radicalize the situation. Now, to go back to German hyperinflation, the German government's got to figure out how to respond, and what they decide to do is use called passive resistance. They tell the German people in that area, don't go to work, don't cooperate. And they're like, well, how do we get paid? And so the Germans say, government says, we'll pay you to not go to work. And so they start sending money to everybody and handing it out. But the German economy is in shambles. And people realize eventually they're just printing money. And so people start saying, well, this isn't worth anything. And so the German government the price of everything in Germany starts flying up. At first, it took 4 German marks to make, that mark is the name of their currency, to make $1 US. But before it's over, it's reached 1 trillion marks. Can you imagine? 1 trillion marks. This is a $1 million bill. Well, 1 million mark bill. I don't even have the trillions. They're having to redo things all the time. This absolutely devastates their economy. And it wipes out the savings of the middle class in Germany because their money's not worth anything anymore. All your savings is gone. It's now worth, I don't know, if you had $200,000 in the bank, it's now worth a pack of cigarettes. So this is going to radicalize them. The only thing that saves it is the Dawes Plan. Here's the German kids playing with all this money as it becomes worthless. What saves it is the Dawes Plan. We step in and we loan money to Germany so that they can recalibrate their currency and begin to make payments to Great Britain and France and Belgium. And then the British and the French and the Belgians can now pay back their loans to us. That was that thing that linked the international economy. But I guess for this part of the lecture, I want you to know that it radicalizes Germany. And we have the beginning of this guy here. Can y'all recognize him in this early picture in the early 20s? Adolf Hitler, right?